The early morning sun cast long shadows across Dover Air Force Base as the colonel adjusted his uniform one final time. 23 years of military service had taught him the importance of every detail, but today, those details carried extra weight. His reflection in the mirror showed a man who had risen through the ranks with unwavering dedication, from his perfectly positioned service ribbons to his meticulously polished shoes. The base was quieter than usual, as if nature itself understood the solemnity of the morning's mission. As he walked across the tarmac, his footsteps echoing in the stillness, the colonel's mind wandered to the young sergeant he would be escorting home. Just a week ago, the sergeant had been leading his unit through a routine patrol when they encountered unexpected resistance. In those crucial moments, the sergeant's quick thinking and selfless actions had saved his entire unit, though at the ultimate cost. Inside the preparation area, the colonel reviewed the documentation one more time. The sergeant's file told a story of excellence. Outstanding performance reviews, commendations for leadership, and most importantly, letters from fellow soldiers describing his unwavering commitment to his team. One particular note stood out, written by a private who had served under him. "He never asked us to do anything he wouldn't do himself. When things got tough, he was always there, leading from the front." The colonel's own journey flashed through his mind, the challenges he'd faced, the barriers he'd broken, and the mentors who had supported him along the way. Rising to the rank of colonel hadn't been easy, especially as a black officer in a system that still struggled with its own biases. But those experiences had only strengthened his resolve to serve with honor and ensure others received the respect they deserved. As he prepared for the escort duty, a young airman approached with the final flight details. "Sir," the airman said, his voice carrying the same reverence that filled the entire base, "the family will be waiting at Arlington. They wanted you to know how much it means to them that someone of your rank is accompanying their son home." The colonel nodded, feeling the weight of their trust. This mission was more than just protocol. It was about honoring a fellow soldier who had given everything for his country. He remembered his first escort duty as a young lieutenant, how it had changed his perspective on service and sacrifice. Now, as a colonel, each escort mission carried even deeper meaning. The morning sun had fully risen as he completed the final preparations. In the distance, he could see the aircraft that would carry them home being ready for departure. Ground crew moved with practiced precision, treating every step of their work with the reverence this mission demanded. The colonel took a moment to stand before the flag-draped transfer case. In the military, they were taught to maintain professional distance, but there were moments when that distance seemed impossible to maintain. This was one of those moments. The sergeant's service record had shown a leader who broke barriers of his own, the first in his family to serve, earning his degree while enlisted, mentoring younger soldiers with the same dedication that had ultimately led to his final act of heroism. As the honor guard approached to begin the transfer ceremony, the colonel straightened his shoulders. The next few days would be challenging, navigating airports and civilians who might not understand the significance of their mission. But he had volunteered for this duty for a reason, to ensure this young sergeant's final journey home would be conducted with all the dignity and respect he had earned. Looking at his watch, the colonel knew it was time to begin their solemn journey. Each step of the process had been carefully planned, from the departure ceremony at Dover to the final ceremony at Arlington. He had personally reviewed every detail, knowing that for the sergeant's family, these moments would become sacred memories. The honor guard moved into position with practiced precision. The colonel had witnessed this ceremony hundreds of times, but its power never diminished. As the first rays of sunlight caught the American flag draped over the transfer case, he silently renewed his commitment to this sacred duty. Whatever challenges lay ahead on their journey home, he would face them with the same courage and dignity that had marked the sergeant's final acts of service. While overseeing the final preparations, the colonel received a message from the sergeant's former commanding officer: "Take care of our boy." He always said that actions speak louder than words. In his final moments, he proved that beyond any doubt. The colonel tucked the message away, adding it to the weight of responsibility he carried. This mission was about more than following protocol. It was about honoring a legacy of service, sacrifice, and unwavering commitment to others. The base chapel bells tolled in the distance, marking the hour. Soon they would begin their journey, carrying precious cargo through a world that sometimes forgot the true cost of service. But the colonel would ensure that, at every step of the way, this fallen hero would be treated with the honor and dignity he deserved. This was more than an assignment, it was a sacred trust, and he would fulfill it no matter what challenges lay ahead. The bustling airport terminal felt worlds away from the solemn quiet of Dover Air Force Base. The colonel walked steadily through the crowd, his polished shoes clicking against the glossy floor as he approached the airline check-in counter. Behind him, 2 honor guard members stood watch over the precious cargo they escorted, a fallen hero making his final journey home. The morning crowd parted instinctively, something about the colonel's bearing and the gravity of his mission creating a natural path through the terminal. Some travelers stopped their rushed conversations, noticing the dignity in his measured steps. Others pulled their children closer, quietly explaining the significance of what they were witnessing. At the check-in counter, the colonel presented his military orders and documentation with practiced precision. The young agent behind the counter seemed uncertain, her eyes darting between the papers and his rank insignia. "One moment, sir," she said, her voice wavering slightly as she called for a supervisor. The supervisor arrived quickly, her heels clicking sharply against the floor. Her demeanor shifted noticeably as she looked from the colonel's dark skin to his military uniform, a professional smile tightening at the edges. "Is there a problem here?" she asked, directing her question to the young agent rather than the colonel. "I'm on official military escort duty," the colonel explained calmly, having dealt with similar situations throughout his career. He gestured to his documentation. "These orders specify first-class accommodation as per military protocol for dignified transfer missions." The supervisor picked up the papers, making a show of examining them closely. Behind her, the flight manifest clearly showed several empty first-class seats on the upcoming flight. "I'm seeing some irregularities in the system," she said, her tone carrying a hint of satisfaction. "We'll have to downgrade you to economy. I'm sure you understand." The colonel took a slow, measured breath. In 23 years of service, he had learned to choose his battles carefully. But this wasn't about him, it was about honoring a fallen soldier and the dignity of his final journey home. "Ma'am," he said, his voice steady and professional, "I need to direct your attention to Military Regulation 2-14, which specifically outlines the protocols for escort duty of fallen service members." He reached into his briefcase and produced the Military Regulations Handbook, its pages marked with yellow tabs from years of reference. The supervisor's expression hardened as she pushed it aside without looking at it. "Sir, if you continue to make a scene, I'll have to call security." The terminal had grown quieter now, the usual chaos of airport noise dimming as nearby passengers began to notice the interaction. A few pulled out their phones, sensing the tension in the air. The colonel remained perfectly still, his posture straight but not aggressive, his voice clear but not raised. "Making a scene is not my intention," he replied, remembering similar moments throughout his career when staying composed had been his strongest weapon. "I'm simply trying to carry out my duties according to military protocol." That young man, he gestured respectfully toward where the honor guard stood watch, gave his life serving this country. "All I'm asking is that we honor his sacrifice by following the established procedures for his final journey home." The supervisor's face flushed, but her stance remained rigid. "The computer system is showing an error with your booking," she insisted, her voice rising slightly. "We can offer you economy class or you can take another flight." An older gentleman in a business suit stepped forward from the growing crowd of onlookers. "Excuse me," he said, pulling out his phone, "but I couldn't help overhearing. I've been filming this interaction and I'm curious, would you like me to share this with your corporate office, or would you prefer to review those first-class seat assignments again?" The supervisor's eyes darted to the phone, then to the growing number of witnesses. More passengers had stopped to watch, many with their own phones raised. A young woman in the crowd wiped tears from her eyes as she recorded the scene. A retired-looking couple shook their heads in dismay. The colonel remained steady, his focus unwavering. This moment wasn't about winning an argument or proving a point. It was about ensuring that a fallen hero received every honor he had earned with his sacrifice. He thought of the young surgeon's family waiting at Arlington, of their trust in him to bring their son home with dignity. Perhaps, the colonel suggested quietly, we could contact your regional manager for clarification on military escort protocols. He kept his tone professional, offering a path toward resolution rather than confrontation. Years of leadership had taught him that sometimes the strongest position was to offer others a way to correct their mistakes gracefully. The growing crowd had begun to murmur, their collective disapproval becoming more apparent. A flight crew member walking past stopped to observe, her eyes widening as she took in the scene. She quickly pulled out her phone and stepped aside, speaking quietly but urgently into it. The supervisor's composure began to crack under the weight of the mounting situation. What had started as a simple denial of service had evolved into something much larger, with dozens of witnesses and countless recording phones. The colonel could see the moment she realized the gravity of her error, but he took no satisfaction in it. Instead, he thought of the young surgeon's final moments of valor, of the letter from the private describing his leadership. "Ma'am," he said gently, "this isn't about you or me. This is about honoring one of our nation's fallen heroes. Now, shall we review those seating assignments one more time?" The tension in the terminal had reached a crescendo, every eye fixed on the unfolding scene. In that moment, the colonel stood not just for himself or even for the fallen sergeant. He stood for every service member who had ever faced discrimination, every hero who deserved better than what the world had offered them. And as the supervisor reached for her computer keyboard with trembling hands, he knew that this moment would have consequences far beyond a simple airline booking. The fluorescent lights of the airport terminal buzzed overhead as the colonel maintained his composed stance at the check-in counter. Years of military training had taught him that true strength often came not from raising your voice, but from standing firm in what you knew was right. His hand rested lightly on the military regulations handbook, a well-worn guide that had served him through countless situations. "I don't appreciate your tone," the supervisor said, her voice carrying a sharp edge that cut through the terminal's usual noise. "The system shows what it shows, and I've made my decision." She crossed her arms, clearly expecting her authority to end the discussion. The colonel thought back to his early days in the service, when a wise commanding officer had told him that leadership wasn't about power, it was about responsibility. Drawing upon that lesson, he spoke clearly but calmly. "With respect, ma'am, this isn't about decisions or systems. This is about following established protocols for the dignified transfer of a fallen service member." He could feel the eyes of other passengers on him, could hear the quiet murmur of phones recording the interaction. But his focus remained on his sacred duty. The young sergeant he was escorting had shown extraordinary courage in his final moments, saving his entire unit without thought for his own safety. The least the colonel could do was show similar courage in ensuring he made it home with full honors. A member of the honor guard approached quietly, standing at a respectful distance. The young guard's presence seemed to remind everyone of the true purpose of this mission. This wasn't about airline policies or computer systems. It was about paying proper respect to someone who had given everything for his country. The supervisor's face flushed deeper as she noticed more passengers gathering. "If you continue to be disruptive," she warned, reaching for her phone, "I'll have no choice but to call security. This is a restricted area." The colonel remained perfectly still, his voice steady. "Ma'am, I want to be very clear about something. I'm not being disruptive. I'm carrying out my duty according to military regulations." He gestured to the documents spread across the counter. "Every paper here is in order. Every protocol is being followed. The only disruption is the unnecessary denial of established military escort procedures." An elderly man in the growing crowd stepped forward, his aged hands gripping a worn veteran's cap. "I served in Vietnam," he said, his voice carrying the weight of experience. "Back then, we didn't always bring our fallen home with the dignity they deserved. Are we still making the same mistakes?" The supervisor's hand tightened on her phone, but uncertainty flickered across her face. The colonel recognized that look. It was the moment when someone began to realize they might be on the wrong side of history. Still, she persisted. "Sir, I've explained the situation. Either accept the economy seat or step aside." The colonel took a slow, deliberate breath. In his career, he had faced barriers both subtle and overt. He had learned that sometimes the strongest response was simply refusing to back down from what was right. "Ma'am, perhaps we should review the airline's published policies regarding military escorts. I have them right here." He reached into his briefcase, movements calm and measured. A young flight attendant who had been watching the scene unfold stepped forward. "Ma'am," she said to the supervisor, her voice professional but firm, "I've just checked with the gate. We have 3 open first-class seats on this flight. Military escort protocol is clear about accommodation requirements." The crowd had grown larger now, phones recording from every angle. An off-duty pilot watched from nearby, shaking his head in disbelief. A young mother explained in hushed tones to her curious child about respect and sacrifice. The terminal had become unusually quiet, as if everyone present understood they were witnessing something important. The colonel thought about the letter in his pocket from the surgeon's mother, thanking him for bringing her son home. He thought about every family who had ever waited for their loved one's final return, about every escort who had ensured that journey was made with dignity. This moment was about more than one flight or one supervisor's bias. It was about upholding the sacred trust between a nation and those who gave their lives in its service. "I'm sure," he said quietly, "that none of us wants this situation to escalate further. I'm simply asking that we follow the established protocols for dignified transfer missions. These aren't optional courtesies, they're earned rights, paid for at the highest price." A group of veterans who had gathered nearby nodded in silent support. One pulled out his phone and appeared to be making calls, speaking in low, urgent tones about respect and dignity. The supervisor's defiance began to waver as she realized the situation had grown far beyond her control. The colonel stood his ground, patient but unmovable. He had learned long ago that sometimes the most powerful stance was simply refusing to accept injustice, no matter how small it might seem to others. Each minute that passed added to the weight of the moment as more passengers stopped to witness what was unfolding. His thoughts returned to the young surgeon, to the story of his final act of courage. That soldier hadn't hesitated when duty called, hadn't backed down in the face of danger. The colonel owed him, owed his family, the same unwavering commitment to doing what was right. The terminal's usual chaos had given way to an almost ceremonial quiet, broken only by the occasional announcement over the PA system. In that strange calm, the colonel's steady presence seemed to remind everyone of the deeper meaning behind this confrontation. It wasn't just about one flight or one seat assignment, it was about honoring promises made to those who gave everything in service to their country. As tension mounted and phones continued recording, the supervisor's position became increasingly untenable. Sometimes, the colonel knew, the strongest victory was giving others the space to correct their own mistakes. He waited patiently, standing as guard not just over his fallen charge, but over the principles of dignity and respect that formed the foundation of his service. The airport terminal had become an unexpected battlefield of principles, but the colonel wasn't standing alone anymore. Like a quiet tide rolling in, veterans and active service members who had been watching the scene began to move forward, forming an informal honor guard around him and the precious cargo he escorted. A retired Marine Corps officer stepped forward first, his bearing still military sharp despite his civilian clothes. "Colonel," he said, his voice carrying the weight of decades of service, "my name is Lieutenant Colonel Retired. I've already contacted the Military Affairs Office. They're reaching out to the airline's corporate headquarters as we speak." The supervisor's face paled slightly as she watched more veterans join the group. A former Air Force sergeant, her service ribbons now replaced by a small pin on her business suit, positioned herself directly in front of the counter. "I spent 15 years coordinating military transport," she said firmly. "Every airline has clear protocols for fallen soldier escorts. This isn't a matter for debate." The crowd of ordinary travelers had grown larger, their phones recording every moment. A young boy tugged at his mother's sleeve, pointing at the gathering veterans. "Mom," he whispered, loud enough to carry, "my teacher says that's what real heroes look like, people who stand up for what's right." The colonel remained steady, his presence calm but unmovable. He watched as more veterans emerged from the crowd, each adding their silent support. A retired Navy Chief Petty Officer wheeled himself forward in his wheelchair, his Vietnam veteran cap proudly displayed. "Some things never change," he said, shaking his head. "But some things must." Social media was already lighting up with live streams of the incident. A young woman in the crowd read from her phone, "This is going viral. There are already calls for airline boycotts from veterans groups across the country." Her voice carried a mix of awe and determination as she hit the share button on her own video. A gate agent from another airline hurried over, her face showing concern. She spoke quietly to one of the gathered veterans, who nodded and stepped toward the colonel. "Sir," he said, "the other airline is offering to accommodate you and your escort detail on their next flight, first class, in accordance with military protocols." But this had become about more than just finding another flight. The colonel thought of every service member who might face similar treatment in the future, of every fallen hero who deserved better. The gathered veterans seemed to understand this without words, their presence sending a clear message: not here, not today. An elderly couple pushed through the crowd, the man wearing a Korean War veteran's cap. His wife carried a small American flag pin on her sweater. "We lost our son in Desert Storm," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "His escort brought him home with such dignity. We can't let them treat him." She gestured toward the fallen soldier's transfer case, like this. The terminal's usual chaos had given way to something else, a quiet solidarity that seemed to spread through the crowd. Business travelers set aside their phones, families stopped to explain the significance to their children, and airline staff from other carriers gathered at the edges of the scene, their faces showing mixed emotions. A young army specialist in uniform, possibly on leave, stepped forward with his phone extended. "Sir, veterans groups are organizing across social media. They're calling every contact they have at the airline's corporate office. This isn't just going viral, it's becoming a movement." The supervisor's earlier hostility had been replaced by growing uncertainty as she watched the scene unfold. Each passing minute brought more supporters, more phones recording, more voices being raised in quiet but firm protest. This wasn't the usual angry crowd demanding customer service. This was something deeper, more powerful. A retired Air Force Master Sergeant made his way through the crowd, his civilian clothes neat but his military bearing unmistakable. "Colonel," he said, "I just got off the phone with my old squadron commander. He's now on the airline's board of directors. He's personally calling the CEO." The power of unity was visible in every face, in every person who chose to stand rather than walk past. A young girl in a Girl Scout uniform stood with her troop, all of them watching with sullen faces as history unfolded before them. Their troop leader explained in hushed tones about honor, respect, and the importance of standing up for what's right. Phone cameras captured the moment when another airline executive hurried into the terminal, his face showing genuine concern. He spoke quietly with his staff, glancing frequently at the gathering of veterans and the steadfast colonel at their center. The landscape of power had shifted. What had started as one man standing his ground had become a demonstration of collective strength and shared values. The colonel thought about all the changes he'd seen in his years of service, about all the barriers that had fallen because people refused to accept injustice as normal. He thought about the young sergeant he was escorting, about how his sacrifice had brought together strangers in this terminal, united in ensuring he would be treated with the dignity he deserved. Around him, the gathering of veterans and supporters continued to grow, their presence a testament to the enduring bonds of service and sacrifice. What had begun as a confrontation over airline policies had transformed into something more significant, a moment when people from all walks of life chose to stand together for respect, dignity, and the sacred duty of honoring those who gave everything for their country. Early morning sunlight streamed through the airline's corporate headquarters as the CEO's private jet touched down. He had cut short his vacation after watching the videos that had dominated social media all night. The weight of the situation showed in his tired eyes as he straightened his tie and prepared to face what had become a defining moment for his company. The colonel sat in a leather chair in the conference room, his uniform as crisp as ever. The past 24 hours had transformed an individual act of discrimination into a national conversation about respect, dignity, and the treatment of service members. He wasn't there for personal vindication. He was there to ensure lasting change. First, the CEO began, his voice carrying genuine remorse. "I want to apologize not just to you, Colonel, but to every service member who has ever faced disrespect while performing their sacred duties." He paused, looking down at the stack of reports his team had compiled overnight. But I know apologies aren't enough. We need real change. The company's new action plan was comprehensive. Mandatory cultural sensitivity training would be instituted across all levels, developed in consultation with veterans organizations. A special liaison office would be established, staffed by veterans, to handle military passenger concerns. The supervisor and staff involved in the incident had already been terminated. We're establishing a military family support fund, the CEO continued, sliding a document across the table. $2 million initially to assist military families traveling for bereavements, medical treatments, or other urgent needs. The colonel nodded, thinking of all the families who would benefit from this unexpected outcome. Down in the terminal, changes were already visible. New signs prominently displayed military escort protocols at every counter. Staff underwent immediate refresher training on dignified transfer procedures. The atmosphere had shifted. Where there had been casual indifference, there was now focused attention to duty. A young gate agent, her eyes bright with purpose, carefully reviewed a service member's documentation. "Thank you for your service," she said, meaning it this time. "Please let me know if there's anything else you need." Behind her, a poster displayed the company's new military passenger Bill of Rights. Veterans organizations had been invited to help reshape the airline's policies. In a nearby conference room, retired service members from every branch shared their experiences, good and bad. "This is how we make it right," a former Marine said, marking up a draft protocol. "Not just for today, but for every service member who comes after." The story had sparked similar reviews across the industry. Other airlines scrambled to examine their own practices, eager to avoid similar incidents. One carrier discovered outdated policies that needed revision. Another found gaps in their training programs. The ripple effects spread far beyond a single terminal or company. In the break room, airline staff watched a new training video featuring real veterans sharing their stories. "I never thought about what these escorts mean to military families," one employee admitted quietly. "Now I understand why every detail matters." His colleagues nodded, the recent events having opened their eyes to the deeper significance of their roles. The colonel's steady presence throughout had set the tone for constructive change rather than mere punishment. When interviewed about the incident, he consistently focused on the future. "This isn't about one day or one flight. It's about honoring our commitments to those who serve and their families." Social media lit up with positive responses to the airline's actions. Veterans shared stories of improved experiences at airports across the country. Military families expressed relief at the new support systems being put in place. What had started as a crisis was transforming into an opportunity for meaningful progress. The CEO made personal calls to veterans organizations, seeking their continued input and oversight. "We want to be held accountable," he told them. "This isn't a one-time fix, it's a permanent change in how we operate." His sincerity was evident in the detailed plans and resources being committed. Training sessions began immediately, with staff learning not just procedures but the human stories behind them. They heard from Gold Star families about the importance of dignified transfers. They learned from veterans about the meaning of military escort duty. Understanding replaced ignorance, empathy overcame indifference. The airline's board of directors authorized additional funding for military passenger services. New lounges were designated for military members and their families. Priority boarding was reinforced for active duty personnel. Every policy was reviewed through the lens of respect and dignity. In the terminals, the change was palpable. Staff who had once viewed military protocols as inconvenient now understood their sacred nature. When a young soldier approached a counter, they saw not just another passenger, but someone who had chosen to serve their country. The colonel's unwavering stance had created space for positive change rather than mere reaction. His dignity under pressure became a teaching point in the new training programs. Leadership isn't about power, the materials noted. It's about standing firm for what's right, even when standing alone. As evening approached, the CEO walked through the terminal where it had all begun. He stopped to watch a military family being assisted by the newly trained staff. The respect was visible in every interaction, every gesture. Real change was taking root, growing from the seeds of that difficult confrontation. The story had become more than a viral moment or a corporate crisis. It had evolved into a catalyst for industry-wide transformation, a reminder that sometimes it takes one person standing firm in their principles to spark lasting change. The Colonel's defense of a fallen soldier's dignity had become a blueprint for honoring all who serve. The morning sun cast long shadows across Arlington National Cemetery as the honor guard moved with precise steps. The Colonel stood straight and tall, watching as they carried the flag-draped transfer case toward its final resting place. The young sergeant's journey home had become more than anyone could have expected. It had become a catalyst for change that would affect countless others. Family members gathered near the gravesite, their faces showing both grief and pride. The sergeant's mother stepped forward to grasp the Colonel's hand. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion, "not just for bringing my boy home, but for making sure he was treated with the dignity he deserved every step of the way." News crews kept a respectful distance, their cameras capturing the solemn ceremony from afar. The story had evolved from a viral moment of confrontation to something deeper, a reminder of the sacred obligations we owe to those who give everything in service to their country. The Colonel's stand for respect had resonated far beyond that airport terminal. In the months that followed, the impact of that day continued to grow. The Colonel found himself speaking at military leadership conferences, sharing not just what had happened, but what it meant for the future. Sometimes, he would tell the young officers, leadership means standing firm not for yourself, but for those who can no longer stand for themselves. Veterans organizations reported a significant change in how airlines handled military escorts and fallen soldier transfers. The incident had sparked an industry-wide review of policies and procedures. One airline executive summed it up simply: "We needed this wake-up call. We needed to remember what really matters." The foundation established in the surgeon's memory grew beyond its original scope. What started as a program to support military families during dignified transfers expanded to include advocacy for veterans' rights and education about military service. The Colonel served on its board, ensuring it stayed true to its core mission of respect and dignity. At airports across the country, new training programs incorporated the lessons learned. Staff members watched real testimonies from military families about what proper honors meant to them. "I used to think all these protocols were just red tape," one employee admitted during a session. "Now I understand. They're about showing respect for sacrifice." The young private whose life the sergeant had saved visited the Colonel 6 months after the incident. "I heard what you did, sir," he said, standing at attention despite his civilian clothes. "The way you stood up for him, that's exactly what he would have done for any of us." The Colonel nodded, understanding the deep truth in those words. Social media continued to share stories of positive changes. Veterans posted about improved experiences at airports, about staff going above and beyond to honor military protocols. What had started as one man's stand had grown into a movement for respect and understanding. A year later, the Colonel returned to that same airport terminal. The changes were immediately visible, not just in the new signs and procedures, but in the attitudes of the staff. A young service member in uniform was being assisted at the counter, treated with genuine respect rather than mere courtesy. The supervisor's position had been filled by a retired military officer who understood the sacred nature of escort duty. "We've completely transformed how we handle military passengers," he told the Colonel. "Your stand that day, it made us all look in the mirror and ask ourselves if we were truly living up to our obligations." Military families shared stories of dignity preserved, of respect shown, of promises kept. A Gold Star mother wrote to thank the Colonel for changing how her daughter's remains were handled during transport. "Because of you," she wrote, "she was treated like the hero she was, every step of the way." The incident became a case study in leadership training, not just for the military but for civilian organizations as well. It demonstrated how one person's unwavering commitment to principle could spark systemic change. Business schools analyzed how the airline's response had transformed a crisis into an opportunity for meaningful reform. The sergeant's story became part of military tradition, shared with new recruits as an example of the bonds that connect all who serve. His sacrifice and the Colonel's defense of his dignity reminded everyone that service doesn't end when a life is given for one's country. It creates an ongoing obligation to honor that sacrifice. At the Foundation's first annual ceremony, hundreds gathered to remember and recommit to the principles of respect and dignity. The colonel stood at the podium, looking out at faces young and old, military and civilian, all united in purpose. "What we do for our fallen heroes," he said, "shows who we are as a nation. Every time we stand up for their dignity, we honor not just their sacrifice, but the values they died defending." The legacy lived on in countless small moments, in the careful handling of a transfer case, in the respectful treatment of a military escort, in the understanding looks of airline staff who had learned the true meaning of their roles. What had begun as a confrontation had become a transformation, a reminder that sometimes the greatest honor we can show our heroes is ensuring they are treated with the dignity they deserve every step of their final journey home.